Welcome back to Nightfall History. Tonight we step into two of the ancient world's most fascinating civilizations and ask a deceptively simple question: what was everyday life really like in Sparta? And how did it compare with life in ancient Egypt? At first glance, Sparta and ancient Egypt seem like an almost unfair comparison. One is remembered as a land of hard warriors, severe discipline, and short answers that could probably cut stone. The other is remembered for pyramids, pharaohs, temples, painted tombs, and a civilization so old and enduring that even the Greeks looked at it with a certain respectful unease, as though Egypt had been around long enough to witness the invention of nostalgia. And yet that is exactly why the comparison is so interesting. These were not merely two ancient states with different clothes and architecture. They were the very different ways of organizing human life. To compare them properly, we should begin not with kings or battles, but with dawn. Imagine first a morning in Sparta. The air is cool in the valley of the Euphrates River. Mountains rise around the region of Laconia like dark guardians. The landscape is stern dry in places, practical rather than lush. Sparta does not present itself as a city of dazzling monuments. It lacks the overwhelming visual display that later empires would love so much. To an outsider, it could even seem strangely plain for a place with such a fearsome reputation. The beauty of Sparta lay less in buildings than in the people it trained, or at least that is what the Spartans themselves would have said, probably with a look suggesting that your admiration of decorative architecture was morally suspicious. Now, imagine a morning in ancient Egypt. The light rises over the Nile. It touches reed beds, fields, canals, mud brick villages, painted shrines, date palms, and the slow movement of boats on the river. Everything feels tied to water, because in Egypt water was not just useful, it was destiny. The Nile was the great organizing force of Egyptian life. It fed fields, linked settlements, carried trade, shaped time itself through the rhythm of flood and harvest, and made possible one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. If Sparta was shaped by mountains and military pressure, Egypt was shaped by a river and the patient regularity of nature. That difference alone tells us a great deal. Sparta grew in a world of rival Greek city-states, warfare, and eternal anxiety. Egypt grew in a river valley where order could be imagined not only as a political necessity, but as a cosmic principle. The Egyptians even had a word for this ideal of balance, justice, and proper order. In Sparta, order meant discipline. In Egypt, order meant harmony, though to be fair, Egyptian rulers were perfectly capable of using force when harmony required a small army. If you were born in Sparta, especially as a boy of the Spartan citizen class, your life was shaped from childhood by the needs of the state. Sparta is often remembered above all for against the harsh educational system that trained boys into disciplined warriors. Though modern popular culture sometimes exaggerates or simplifies it, the basic truth remains: Spartan society expected male citizens to be tough, obedient, communal, and militarily ready. A Spartan boy was not raised mainly to pursue private success, personal comfort, or eloquent self-expression. He was raised to serve the collective strength of Sparta. If you were born in ancient Egypt, your childhood would usually be shaped not by a military state training system, but by family, work, religion, and the rhythms of the local community. Egyptian life was deeply structured, but not in the Spartan way. The household was central. So was the village, the temple, the field, the workshop, and the bureaucracy of the state. Ancient Egypt was not a society where every boy was being sharpened into a spear point. It was a society where most people were expected to take their place within a vast and ordered world, one in which farming, craftwork, ritual, and administration mattered at least as much as fighting. This is one of the clearest contrasts between the two civilizations. Sparta asked, how do we produce disciplined citizens capable of defending a fragile ruling order? Egypt asked, how do we sustain a stable, prosperous, and divinely ordered society? Along the Nilean daily life followed from that. In Sparta, life for full male citizens was intensely communal. Boys were gradually separated from ordinary household life and brought into systems of training that emphasized endurance, obedience, competition, and group loyalty. They learned to live with less food, less softness, less privacy, less complaint. A Spartan education included music and poetry, which is something modern stereotypes often forget, but even these were meant to strengthen discipline and civic identity, not create dreamy aesthetes wandering about with liars and opinions. In Egypt, children were raised within the household and trained largely for the life they were expected to lead. A farmer's child learned the rhythms of agricultural work. A scribe's child might be educated in writing, mathematics, and administration. A craftsman's child might learn a trade. Elite children could receive more formal education, especially boys destined for priesthood, bureaucracy, or administration. But there was no Egyptian equivalent of the Spartan agate shaping the entire elite male population into a common martial mold. And that affects not just childhood, but the emotional atmosphere of each society. Spartan life seems to have prized self-control, toughness, and brevity. One can imagine that emotional display was not exactly encouraged in many public settings. If a Spartan stubbed his toe, he was probably expected to react as though pain were a tedious rumor, spread by weaker civilizations. Egyptian life, by contrast, seems more domestically textured in the surviving evidence. Family affection appears in tomb paintings, letters, love poetry, and household scenes. This should not be romanticized too much. Ancient life was hard almost everywhere. But Egyptian culture leaves behind a more visibly domestic and affectionate record than Sparta does. Then there's the question of the city itself, or rather the built environment. Sparta was by ancient standards surprisingly unshowy. It lacked the theatrical monumentality people often expect from a famous civilization. The Spartans did not invest as heavily in urban spectacle because their prestige came from military reputation, ancestral law, and austere identity. They were not trying to impress the world with towers, painted tombs, colossal statues, and grand temples on the Egyptian scale. Their idea of civic excellence was embodied, not monumental. Egypt, on the other hand, loved monumental permanence. Temples, tombs, pyloned obelisks, colossal statues, decorated burial chambers, processional ways, and sacred complexes were woven deeply into elite Egyptian life and into the state's self-presentation. Egypt built not only for the living, but for eternity. The stone architecture of Egypt was political, religious, and cosmic all at once. A pharaoh did not merely rule. He inscribed rule into the landscape. Sparta built citizens. Egypt built memory. And memory in Egypt was no small matter. Egyptians were deeply concerned with the afterlife, proper burial, continuity of the soul, and the preservation of identity beyond death. This shaped art, religion, labor, and daily practice in profound ways. Tombs were prepared, names were recorded, rituals were performed, and the dead were sustained through offerings and remembrance. To live in Egypt was to live in a civilization that thought constantly about death, not in a gloomy sense, but in a structured and almost administrative way. The Egyptians managed eternity with impressive paperwork. The Spartans, by contrast, are not remembered for elaborate tomb culture or grand visions of the afterlife in the Egyptian sense. Their social energy was directed far more toward collective discipline in the present than toward monumental preparation for the world beyond. A Spartan funeral was unlikely to involve an 80-foot statue, a painted chamber, and a theological essay in image form. It was more likely to remind everyone to be honorable, restrained, and useful to Sparta while still alive. Food reveals another contrast. A Spartan meal, especially in the communal messes of adult male citizens, was meant to reinforce equality, discipline, and a certain contempt for indulgence. The famous black broth, whether quite as dreadful as its legend suggests, or simply a matter of local taste and low expectations, became a symbol of Spartan austerity. The point was not culinary delight. The point was shared endurance. In Egypt, diet was shaped heavily by the Nile and its agriculture. Bread and beer formed the staples of life for many. Vegetables, onions, leeks, fish, dates, figs, and sometimes meat played important roles. Depending on class and circumstance, Egyptian food culture was practical, but comparatively abundant in its agricultural base. The river valley could be astonishingly productive. Daily meals for ordinary people were still modest, but Egypt's economy rested on agricultural richness in a way that gave its civilization a very different foundation from Sparta's militarized austerity. If Sparta taught you that appetite should be controlled, Egypt taught you that life depended on successful management of fertile abundance, and that management required work, a great deal of it. This is where another myth deserves careful handling. Ancient Egypt is often imagined as a civilization built entirely by whipped slaves, dragging stones across the desert under a pitiless sun. That image is far too simple. Large state labor projects certainly demanded immense effort, and coercion absolutely existed, but many scholars argue that major building projects, such as pyramids, relied heavily on rotating labor obligations paid or provisioned workers and agricultural cycles that freed labor during parts of the year. Egypt was not a gentle utopia, but neither was it only the old Hollywood image of endless chains and sand. Sparta, meanwhile, rested on another form of coerced labor that was in many ways more central to its social identity, the Hellid system. The Helots, especially in Messenia, were a conquered population forced to work the land and support Spartan citizens. This was one of the great hidden engines of Spartan life. The famous Spartan focus on discipline and warfare was made possible because others labored beneath them. In that sense, the simplicity of Spartan citizen life rested on a structure of domination that was severe, anxious, and permanent. Egypt had hierarchy, class divisions, and state labor demands. Sparta had all of that plus the constant fear of those it oppressed. That fear matters. It shaped Spartan society at every level. A relatively small ruling citizen body lived among a much larger dependent population. Much of Spartan discipline was not simply preparation for war against outsiders. It was insurance against rebellion from within. Beneath the polished legend of fearless Spartans, there was always a shadow of insecurity. Egyptian rulers also feared unrest, of course. No large ancient state was entirely relaxed, but Egyptian society, especially in its stable period, seems to have been organized less around permanent internal siege psychology than Sparta was. Egypt's state ideology emphasized cosmic order, divine kingship, agricultural continuity, and social stability. Sparta's ideology emphasized toughness, obedience, and control. One reassured itself through harmony, the other reassured itself through hardness. Women experienced these worlds differently as well. Spartan women are famous for having enjoyed more visibility, property rights, and social presence than many women elsewhere in the Greek world. They could own land, manage estates, and move with a degree of public confidence that shocked or impressed outside observers. They were expected to be physically strong and were openly valued for producing strong children. Again, this was not equality in a modern sense, but it was a striking contrast to many other Greek societies. Egyptian women also possessed notable legal and economic rights by ancient standards. They could own property, inherit, manage assets, divorce in some circumstances, and appear in contracts. Egyptian art and documents suggest a society in which women, while still operating within hierarchy and patriarchy, had recognized legal identities and practical agency. In fact, compared with many ancient cultures, Egyptian women often appear surprisingly visible in legal and domestic life. Egypt and Sparta, oddly enough, each offer examples of women holding more space than outsiders might expect, but the tone differed. Spartan women were admired for strength within a military society. Egyptian women were integrated into a broader social, domestic, legal, and religious world. A Spartan woman's social value was tied closely to the martial state. An Egyptian woman's social value belonged to the wider continuity of household, property, religion, and family order. And then there's religion, which touched every part of Egyptian life in ways far more visible and elaborate than in Sparta. The Egyptians lived in a world saturated with divine presence. Temples were not merely places of worship, but economic, political, and ceremonial centers. Gods were local, cosmic, personal, royal, and environmental all at once. The Nile, the sun, the sky, death, fertility, kingship, order, everything was woven into sacred meaning. Priests, festivals, processions, rituals, sacred images, offerings, and temple estates formed part of the lived fabric of Egyptian society. Sparta was religious, to deeply so, but in a more restrained and civic way. Greek religion there was tied to ancestral custom, more sacrifice, omen, and communal identity. The Spartans took religion seriously enough to delay campaigns for sacred reasons, but they did not build their entire social imagination around massive temple civilizations the way Egypt did. Egyptian religion filled the landscape. Spartan religion disciplined it. Already, even before we move into politics, class, and the deeper texture of adulthood, the contrast is clear. To wake in Sparta was to wake inside a severe social machine that prized strength, sameness, and control. To wake in ancient Egypt was to wake inside an ordered river civilization that prized continuity, fertility, divine harmony, and endurance across time. One society hardened the individual for the collective. The other placed the individual inside a vast cosmic and agricultural rhythm, and that difference shaped not only what people did all day, but what they believed life was for. If childhood in Sparta and ancient Egypt taught different lessons, adulthood made those lessons visible in every corner of life. A Spartan man of the citizen class was expected to become, above all else, a disciplined member of a warrior society. His adulthood was not a process of discovering personal preferences so much as confirming public ones. He was expected to train, to dine in communal messes, to serve militarily, to marry, and to contribute to the collective identity of Sparta. Even marriage in the Spartan imagination was closely tied to the needs of the state. Personal affection may have existed naturally, because human beings are stubbornly human. In every system ever devised, but the ideal language of Spartan society treated the household as subordinate to the larger civic and military order. An Egyptian man, by contrast, entered adulthood through a much broader set of possible roles. He might farm the land, serve in temple administration, work as a craftsman, transport goods, by river labor on construction projects, join the army, or if especially fortunate and educated, become a scribe. The Egyptian state was highly organized, but it did not demand that every respectable male become a near-professional warrior. It demanded that people fit into the machinery of order, and in Egypt that machinery was civil as much as military. The difference can be felt in the texture of work. In Sparta, the ideal citizen was not supposed to spend his days in ordinary labor. That work was largely pushed downward onto helots and other non-citizen groups. Commerce, craftsmanship, and agricultural labor did not define elite Spartan identity in the way they did elsewhere. A Spartan citizen was meant to be free from those concerns so that he could devote himself to training, discipline, and civic duty. This sounds noble until one remembers that someone else still had to do the work, and that someone else was usually not being asked particularly politely. In Egypt, work was not simply tolerated, it was the structure of life. Farmers timed their labor to the seasons of the Nile. Artisans carved stone-shaped wood, painted walls, wove linen-fired pottery, and crafted tools. Bowmen moved people and goods through the river system. Temple workers maintained ritual life. Builders, surveyors, and officials served the needs of the state. And scribes, those elegant bureaucratic magicians of the ancient world, recorded, counted, assessed, taxed, copied, and filed reality into something the kingdom could understand. To become a scribe in Egypt was one of the great social ambitions available to a talented boy. Egyptian texts sometimes praised the scribe's life in almost advertising-like terms, contrasting it with the backbreaking labor of farming or manual work. The message is clear: learn to write, and perhaps you will spend less of your life ankle-deep in mud while the sun attempts to personally settle a grievance with you. Writing in Egypt was power because administration was power, and Egypt was a civilization that ran on both grain and paperwork. Sparta, by contrast, did not romanticize bureaucracy. One struggles to imagine a Spartan poem entitled In Praise of Tax, Documentation, the civic imagination that was directed elsewhere. To the Spartans, the highest male ideal was not the administrator, but the disciplined warrior citizen. Egypt admired the man who could read a grain account properly. Sparta admired the man who could hold the line and say very little about it afterward. This is not merely a contrast in labor, but in prestige. In Sparta, honor belonged above all to martial discipline and civic austerity. In Egypt, honor could belong to piety, craft, literacy, service, stability, and proper placement within a cosmic order. And then there is politics. Spartan politics were narrow, conservative, and tightly structured. The system, with its dual kingship, efforts, council of elders, and assembly, fascinated later thinkers. But in practice, it served a small citizen elite and a deeply guarded social order. Spartan politics were about preserving what existed. Change was dangerous because the whole system depended on maintaining a fragile internal balance over a much larger unfree population. The state had the personality of a man standing very still because he suspects the floorboards beneath him. Egyptian politics, on the other hand, revolved around kingship on a scale almost unimaginable in Greece. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler in the ordinary sense. He was the central figure in a divine and cosmic order, the guarantor of Matha, mediator between gods and people, and the visible face of state continuity. In practice, of course, the strength of any particular pharaoh varied, and periods of Egyptian history were not all equally stable. There were weak kings, strong kings, civil wars, competing dynasties, foreign invasions, reforms, and moments when the machinery of order clearly required maintenance. But the ideal remained powerful. Egypt was a land ruled from above by sacred kingship, not by a militarized citizen elite wary of its own labor force. To live under Sparta was to live under a society of rulers. To live under Egypt was to live under a sacred state. That makes religion even more central to the comparison. In Sparta, religion was serious, ancestral, and bound to civic life. Sacrifices, festivals, omens, and rituals mattered. The Spartans were not secular in any meaningful sense, but their religious practice appears relatively restrained beside the immense visual and ceremonial world of Egypt. Egyptian religion was not confined to special occasions or polite invocations before important decisions. It saturated the landscape. Gods had temples, estates, priests offering sacred animals, festivals, myths, and local cults Religion touched law, kingship, death, agriculture, architecture, and the calendar. Egyptian daily life took place inside a sacred universe so textured that almost every action could be linked to order, pollution, offerings, blessings, dangerous forces, or divine protection. A household might keep amulets, make offerings, invoke protective deities, or observe rituals related to birth, illness, fertility, and the dead. The great temples were not only religious institutions, but economic engines and centers of elite culture. To walk through Egypt was to move through a sacred geography. Sparta, by contrast, was sacred without becoming visually overwhelming in the same way. One suspects that if an Egyptian priest had invited a Spartan to see a temple procession with sacred barks, incense clouds, painted columns, chanting priests, musicians, and gold-encrusted divine images, the Spartan might have stood through it all with admirable self-control and then quietly concluded that the whole thing was a bit much. But the Egyptian would likely have felt the same in reverse while watching Spartans eat in silence and treat seasoning as a moral failing. The home itself reveals another difference. A Spartan household was important, but not sovereign in the Roman or Egyptian sense. Male citizens were repeatedly drawn out of private domestic life into the discipline of the collective. The household existed, wives and children mattered, but a man's identity belonged substantially to Sparta as a military and civic organism. His meals were often communal, his obligations public, his values supervised by peers. Privacy in the modern emotional sense was not the ideal. Egyptian domestic life feels more visible and more richly represented in the evidence. Houses varied by class, of course. A peasant dwelling in a village of mud brick walls and reed mats was very different from the elegant residences of wealthier officials. But Egyptian homes were centers of family life, food preparation, children, household, religion, and ordinary affection. We see scenes of couples, children, servants, animals, music, and daily routine in the surviving art. There's an entire civilization of domestic gestures there. Quieter than temples and tombs perhaps, but deeply human. Even the material feel of life was different. Spartan life, at least for its citizen ideal, was marked by controlled simplicity. Clothing was practical, food plain, housing modest by elite standards. Elsewhere, and personal display discouraged. The body itself became the main project, hardened, trained, disciplined, and subordinated to communal expectation. Egyptian life was also practical for most people, but materially more expressive. Linen garments, jewelry, amulets, cosmetics, household furniture, painted surfaces, carved objects, decorated coffins, carved utensils, vessels, and tools all suggest a society more at ease, with visible beauty woven into everyday life. Egyptian elegance was not only for palaces. Even modest lives could contain color, ornament, and ritual care. Egypt liked making the world visible. Sparta trusted severity more than style. This contrast extends to the senses. Imagine the sounds of a Spartan day: footsteps in training yards, commands, choral song and ritual, the striking of practiced weapons, sparse conversation, the plain noise of a society that keeps ornament under discipline. Now imagine an Egyptian day: water against boats, voices in markets, donkeys and cattle, grain being ground, priests chanting in temple courts, tools in workshops, children in courtyards, women weaving, scribes reciting accounts, the river moving patiently through it all. Egypt sounds less like a barracks and more like a civilization, in which life's many functions continue together under an enormous sky. And then we come to death, where no comparison between Sparta and Egypt can remain shallow for long. For the Egyptians, death was not merely an end, but a transition requiring immense cultural effort. The dead had to be buried properly, named properly, remembered properly, and equipped properly. Mummification, burial goods, funerary texts, tomb decoration, offerings, and rites all reflected the belief that identity must be preserved beyond death. To live in Egypt was to live in a civilization that treated death as a continuation of order. Sparta, by comparison, did not invest the same cultural energy in preserving the individual dead through elaborate material means. Spartan burial customs were simpler. The honor of the dead was tied more to civic memory, martial valor, and social role than to personal eternity, elaborately staged in tomb architecture. Egyptian death culture preserved identity through ritual materiality. Spartan death culture preserved honor through discipline and remembrance. That may be the single most poetic contrast of all. Egypt asked how a person might endure forever. Sparta asked how a person might live in such a way that the city would remember him correctly. One civilization embalmed the body, the other sharpened the reputation. Women again provide a fascinating comparison. As we noted earlier, Spartan women were unusually visible and economically significant by the standards of much of the Greek world. Because Spartan men were so absorbed by military life, women often managed estates and exercised practical authority. Their strength, outspokenness, and relative freedom impressed and unsettled outsiders. They belonged to a society where the state cared greatly about reproduction, inheritance, and the maintenance of the citizen class, and women therefore occupied a more publicly acknowledged position than in many other Greek poleis. Egyptian women, meanwhile, moved within a legal and domestic framework that granted them notable rights in property and contract. They could buy, inherit, divorce, litigate, and hold property in ways that still surprised many modern readers. Elite women could become influential in religious and political contexts, and in rare but striking cases, women could even rule as pharaoh. Hatshepsut remains perhaps the most famous example, though certainly not the only powerful royal woman in Egyptian history. The daily implications of this are important. An Egyptian woman, especially outside the highest elites, still lived within a patriarchal world, but not one in which she vanished legally. A Spartan woman likewise lived in a patriarchal military society, but one that granted her unusual visibility and estate power. In both civilizations, women were more substantial actors than simplistic ancient stereotypes usually allow. The difference lies in the systems around them. Sparta gave women space because its male citizens lived within military discipline. Egypt gave women space because its legal and domestic order was broader and more administratively structured. And now we arrive at perhaps the most important difference of all. What each society believed human life was for. Sparta believed that life, at least for its ruling citizen class, was meant to produce discipline, endurance, and collective strength. The ideal life was not the comfortable one, or the expressive one, or the materially beautiful one. It was the honorable one, hard, controlled, and useful to Sparta. Egypt believed that life was meant to be properly ordered within a cosmic whole. One should honor the gods, sustain the household, perform one's work, preserve balance, respect the dead, maintain continuity, and participate in the great rhythm of fertility, kingship, and divine order. The ideal life was not joyless, it was structured. It had room for beauty, ritual, memory, and continuity. If Sparta resembles a titan fist, Egypt resembles a river system. One gathers force through compression, the other sustains life through flow. But daily life was not only ideals, it was also fear. The Spartans feared softness, dishonor, and hellish revolt. The Egyptians feared disorder, failed harvest, impiety, and the breaking of mat. These fears shaped ordinary behavior. A Spartan man was haunted by the possibility of public shame. An Egyptian official might be haunted by failure in duty, by divine imbalance, or by the possibility that the afterlife would judge him less kindly than he had hoped. Ancient texts from Egypt often show concern with moral order, proper speech, measured conduct, and justice. In Sparta, judgment came primarily from one's peers and the city. In Egypt, judgment could continue well beyond the grave. That changes the emotional architecture of life. A Spartan needed to be seen as strong. An Egyptian needed to be aligned with order. And that is where our comparison becomes more personal, because once we understand what each civilization feared, admired, and rewarded, we can finally ask the question, at the center of the whole comparison, which world would actually have felt harder to live in? The answer, unsurprisingly, depends very much on who you were. And once we step beyond famous warriors and shining pharaohs, the ancient world becomes much more revealing and much less polite. For an elite Spartan citizen, life may have felt hard, but meaningful. The rules were strict, the meals plain, the expectations severe, but there was dignity in belonging to the ruling core of a society that admired courage above comfort. A Spartan might look at the Egyptian world, at its painted tombs, jewelry, temples, scribes, perfumes, and polished rituals, and conclude that it was all slightly too comfortable, slightly too elaborate, slightly too willing to trust beauty. To a Spartan, mind beauty that did not produce toughness was always in danger of becoming decoration, and decoration was often just softness, wearing expensive sandals. For an Egyptian elite, however, Spartan life might have seemed unnecessarily narrow. Why build a society that strips so much away? Why make severity into a civic ideal? Why turn meals into endurance exercises and childhood into an obstacle course designed by people with a philosophical objection to blankets? An Egyptian official, especially a literate one, might well have looked at Sparta and seen not purity, but self-imposed poverty, a possibility, a civilization that prized one virtue so intensely it had little room left for the others. That is the fascinating thing about comparison. Each society reveals the blind spots of the other. Sparta exposes how much ancient Egypt valued continuity, beauty, ritual, and administration. Egypt exposes how radically Sparta reduced life to discipline, hierarchy, and military usefulness. And that means the real answer to the question which life was harder depends entirely on where you are standing. If you were a Spartan citizen boy entering the Agate, life in Sparta was undeniably hard. You would be trained to endure hunger, discomfort, pain, and public judgment. You would grow up in a system designed to make you less attached to softness and more attached to the collective. You would be measured not by your originality, but by your discipline. There is very little in that childhood that feels gentle. An Egyptian child, by comparison, would usually grow up in a domestic and occupational world, rather than a militarized state system. Life might still be difficult, especially for ordinary families dependent on harvest taxes, labor obligations, and class hierarchy. But it was not organized around the same brutal formation of the self. Childhood in Egypt appears, at least from what survives, more embedded in family craft, ritual, and daily routine than in institutional hardness. If you were an ordinary agricultural laborer, the comparison becomes more complicated. A peasant farmer in Egypt worked hard, extremely hard. Agriculture in any ancient civilization was labor-intensive, uncertain, and physically demanding. Even with the Nile's fertility, success still required human effort, coordination, and vulnerability to the state's demands. Taxes could bite deeply. Floods could fail. Local administration could be burdensome. Heat, insects, disease, and manual labor were constants. Ancient Egypt may look calm in art, but no one should mistake pain as serenity for a life free from exhaustion. The fields were beautiful from a distance, less so when you were in them. A helot in Sparta, however, lived under something more openly oppressive. The helot was not merely poor or overworked. He belonged to a conquered population structurally subjected to a ruling minority that feared him. That fear made Spartan domination especially harsh. So for the lower and unfree classes, life in Sparta may well have been harder, in a more explicitly coercive, humiliating, and militarized sense. Rome, to borrow a comparison from your previous topic, was complicated. Egypt was ordered. Sparta was severe. For ordinary dependent laborers, severity has a way of being memorable. If you were a woman, the answer again depends on which freedoms matter most. A Spartan woman had unusual visibility, property, influence, and social confidence by Greek standards. She may have moved with greater public ease and economic weight than many of her counterparts elsewhere, but she also lived inside a society whose values were relentlessly directed toward the military state. Her strength was admired because it served Spartan reproduction, Spartan order, Spartan continuity. The space she had was real, but not free-floating. An Egyptian woman also possessed notable legal and economic standing for the ancient world. She could own property, engage in contracts, inherit, and in some cases divorce. She participated in a civilization where domestic, religious, and legal life gave her recognized presence. Her world may have allowed more integration into everyday social and legal structures, rather than tying visibility so tightly to one militarized social ideal. So which life was freer? Perhaps Egyptian life was broader, while Spartan life was in some cases more publicly forceful. One offered inclusion in a richly ordered society. The other offered strength within a narrow and demanding one. And then there is the matter of fear, because fear often determines whether a life feels hard. The Egyptian farmer feared the flood, failing the tax collector, arriving, disease entering the household, or misfortune disturbing the fragile order of things. The Spartan citizen feared dishonor, weakness, public shame, and the ever-present tension beneath the social order. The Spartan helot feared the Spartan state. These are not equal fears. One is the fear of uncertainty, another is the fear of judgment. The third is the fear of domination itself. And this is why Sparta can never be romanticized too easily. Its famous austerity was not floating freely in noble air. It rested on force. A society that tells its ruling class to live simply while compelling others to labor beneath them is not practicing moral purity. It is distributing comfort and hardship in a very particular way. Egypt was hardly egalitarian, of course. Far from it. It had kings, priests, officials, laborers, servants, dependent workers, and moments of severe inequality. But its ideal was not built around permanent martial compression of a ruling minority over a conquered labor population. In quite the same way, Egypt's hierarchy was sacred and bureaucratic. Sparta's hierarchy was militarized and anxious. That anxiety may be the hidden key to the whole comparison. Egypt in its stable era seems to have believed that life could be ordered, cultivated, aligned, and repeated. There is confidence in that worldview. The Nile would rise, fields would be planted, rituals would be performed, kings would rule, the dead would be remembered, and the cosmic order would continue. If properly maintained, Sparta does not project that kind of confidence. It projects vigilance. It is always holding itself together. It trusts training more than abundance, severity more than fertility, and discipline more than continuity. Egypt can imagine eternity. Sparta can imagine endurance, and those are not the same thing. This is why even the landscapes seem to speak different philosophies. The Nile Valley says life is possible here because nature, labor, and sacred order cooperate. The Valley of the Euphrates says life is defensible here if people remain hard enough. One civilization learned to ride a river, the other learned to stand in formation. One leaves behind temples filled with painted afterlives. The other leaves behind stories of men who answered requests to surrender their weapons with come and take them. And perhaps unsurprisingly, later generations have loved borrowing symbols from both, while ignoring the parts that would have made them personally miserable. Modern admirers of Sparta often want the discipline without the social rigidity, the courage without the cruelty, the simplicity without the black broth, and the warrior ethos without the lifelong surveillance of peers. In other words, they want the poster version. Modern admirers of Egypt often want the beauty, mystery, symbolism, and permanence without the agricultural, labor, taxation, state obligations, disease, environment, or occasional dynastic collapse. Again, the poster version. History is unfortunately for posters made mostly of ordinary lives. An ordinary life in ancient Egypt would often have felt repetitive, physical, sacred, practical, familia-centered, and woven into the river and the calendar. Ordinary life in Sparta would often have felt supervised, disciplined, class-bound, politically narrow, and morally compressed by the expectations of the state, which would have felt more bearable for many people, probably Egypt, which would have felt harsher for many people, probably Sparta. But harsher does not always mean poorer, and broader does not always mean kinder. Egypt offered more room for beauty, domestic life, religion, literacy, craft, and continuity. Sparta offered more clarity of purpose for its ruling class, though at a severe cost to everyone beneath and around that ideal. In a strange way, these two civilizations represent the ancient answers to the same question: how should human beings live together? Egypt answered in balance, in hierarchy, in continuity, in sacred order, in relationship to land gods and the dead. Sparta answered in discipline, in obedience, in austerity, in collective strength, in fearlessness, and in constant readiness. One built an eternal civilization from fertility and ritual. The other built a legendary one from control and renunciation, and both in their own way succeeded for a time. That final phrase matters, for a time, because neither system was timeless, however much each tried to present itself as the natural order of things. Egypt endured astonishingly long, but passed through fragmentation, conquest, reform, and transformation. Sparta produced one of the most recognizable civic identities in world history, but its model was difficult to sustain and even harder to adapt. Egypt could absorb, Sparta could resist. History usually rewards absorption for longer, and that may be the quiet final lesson here. A hard life can produce resilience. An ordered life can produce continuity, but no civilization survives forever simply because it believes strongly in itself. It survives because its structures continue to function under pressure. Egypt's were broad, agricultural, sacred, and administrative. Sparta's were narrow, martial, and socially brittle. So if you had to choose between them, and thankfully tonight you do not, one offered a life shaped by river, ritual, work, memory, and cosmic order. The other offered a life shaped by discipline, scarcity, hierarchy, and the demand to be useful to the state. One world asked you to belong to eternity. The other asked you to be worthy of legend. And perhaps that is the softest way to say it. Ancient Egypt tried to preserve life. Sparta tried to perfect it. Preservation is usually gentler than perfection. Thank you for spending this quiet stretch of the night with Nightfall History. And as these two ancient worlds fade back into darkness, one lit by temple lamps beside the Nile, the other by the cold discipline of Laconia, perhaps the question that remains is not simply which life was harder, but which vision of life felt more human. Until the next story, sleep well.